and it's very nice to meet everybody. And I appreciate that I heard you were reading my book, and I'm happy to talk to you all about that as well. Today I'm talking about Ibn Hajar Al Asqalani's Merits of the Plague. And in this book, this was a book that in some ways was both inspired by my first book, but also from the COVID pandemic. If everyone, I'm sure, has some memory of this. And I think, so I think, if you are a Hadith student, then you probably have heard of Ibn Hajar Al Asqalani. Many people know him as the great author of Fath al-Bari, this amazing multi-volume commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari, which is often considered, one of the soundest collection of hadith. And he spent 30 years working on this book, Fath al-Bari. If you go into almost any Islamic bookstore, you will find his commentary on it. He explains every aspect of almost every hadith in the text. He worked on it for 30 years. He returned to it year after year. We even have early drafts of him writing this book. And so if you are interested in hadith studies, you know Ibn Hajar because he's this great Ḥadīth. He's this great hadith scholar, and he's the great author of Fath al-Bari. But in his own lifetime, he was also a very important judge. He was one of the most important Shafi'i judges of his time. He was appointed on and off of the highest court in the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. And so he had, in this way, many of his rulings were considered very influential and important. And he was seen as a public figure in this way. So when he would describe hadith or think about hadith or study hadith, he would think about how it would influence the public, how it might influence, how the public might benefit from his hadith. And of course, the other thing about Ibn Hajar was he was also a very prosperous trader. He was a merchant. So he would go and he would sell many different kinds of things, sugar, spices, textiles, and things like that. And he would travel all the way from Egypt across the Red Sea to Yemen while he was going on pilgrimage or study. And we know that he actually had many of his assets in pepper, and he even owned part of a sugar refinery. So he was wealthy. He was wealthy. He was an important judge. He was a great hadith scholar, and in this way, he was he was both a person who thought about the world that we're living in, and he also at the same time he was very deep in his own study of hadith. And but what's so interesting about Ibn Hajar is he really tried to bring these two worlds together: the world, his intellectual life, where he was studying hadith, and the world in which he lived, in which he was a judge, in which he was a trader, in which he had a family and children, and in which he cared about the politics of the time. So this is one of the reasons why Ibn Hajar is such an interesting figure, because in addition to being a hadith scholar and a judge and a trader, he would also write history, and he would think about the history of his own time, and he would think about the people and the politics of his own time. So this was, why he made such an interesting figure in my first book, because I was interested in both the social life and the political life of Hadith and Hadith commentators and Hadith scholars, as well as their intellectual debates and their intellectual life. And Ibn Hajar is this figure who really brings these two worlds together in an interesting way. Now, so I told you he was Ḥadīth. I told you he was a historian and a trader and a judge on the highest court. But on top of that, Ibn Hajar also lived through the plague. He lived through the Black Death, and it was one of the worst epidemics of his time. It was worse than it was so much worse than COVID. At the peak of the Black Death in the 14th century, of course, people didn't have any of the same modern tools or modern skills to try to fight the disease and understanding things about public health, and with modern medicine. So for this reason, it was really a devastating plague, and not only was there mass death, there was mass displacement, and just like in COVID, where the economy shut down and there was all of these uncertainty, the same thing happened, even in the 14th and 15th centuries, in Ibn Hajar's day. And so I had been working on this book I'm writing now about Ibn Hajar and the spice trade, and thinking about Hadith and its connection in the Islamic intellectual tradition and its relationship to global trade. When the pandemic happened, and everything shut down, and I was thinking about what to do. I was kicked out of the library because everything had closed, and it was at that point that I remembered that Ibn Hajar. I was talking to one of my colleagues, Miraj Sayed, who's also a scholar who works on Hadith at the University of California, and I mentioned to him that Ibn Hajar had written this treatise on the plague to try to explain to his audience, what to do, how to respond to the plague, and again, really trying to bring these two worlds together, right? The world of his scholarship and Hadith, and the world that he was living in. And we know, for instance, what he thought, how he witnessed the plague, because he wrote this history of it, where he would describe what was happening in this one of the great, what he called the Great Death or the Great Extinction of 833 of the Hijra calendar, 1429 or 1430 of the Common Era. And this is what Ibn Hajar described, in the world that he saw. He saw the death toll in Cairo had reached 300 a day, excluding those that the government did not record. And he described the Nile as full of fish and crocodiles, floating dead, floating belly up. And he described gazelles and wolves that were found that way in the countryside. And he described the scene where those who carried the dead, who washed the dead, who prepared their graves had become so scarce. It was so hard to find someone to help prepare the dead that people would dig a mass grave, a large pit, and cast bodies into it. And he even describes these stray dogs digging up I mean, it's very graphic, right? It's this horrible, horrible scene that they're digging up in this mass grave. And he describes the caskets are in such a large number. He just says they were like white vultures circling carrion. And in the streets, it was as if a parade of caskets were a long string of camels tied by the tail, one following the other. So you can see this really, this was a scene that Ibn Hajar lived through. He has many descriptions of how the Sultan, then the Sultanate in Cairo tried to respond to the plague and the Black Death. They do many different kinds of things. They do processionals. They go out. They don't know. They don't know how even to pray to ask God to lift the plague. Some of the advisors are telling the Sultan he should take everyone out. Muslims, Christians, and Jews out into the desert, and they should say a prayer for lifting a drought or breaking, praying for rain, because they don't know how to respond in a religious way to the plague. And so Ibn Hajar sees this, and he's been studying all of these hadith. He knows everything that's been said, about the plague, about what kinds of prayers you should make in, under which circumstances, how to understand the plague. What is it? Because that's the other thing too, is, the plague would take the life of, innocent people. It would take the life of seemingly, people who he thought were wicked. The plague took the life of his own daughter. Actually, 3 of his children were taken by the plague. One of his daughters was expecting a child, so his unborn grandchild was also killed by the plague in this year. So why it's one of these fundamental questions is why the problem of suffering. Why do innocent people die? Why would innocent people be killed in a plague? It's one of these fundamental, almost existential questions. Why when there's mass death, why would innocent people die? Why would children die from this? Why would God, if this is an expression of God's will, why would God will this? So it is a public health issue that the government needs to address. They need to record the deaths. They need to figure out some way of addressing it. But it's also this fundamental religious issue, which is how to make sense of God's will in this circumstance. So Ibn Hajar writes this book as a way to solve this problem, to offer some solution to this, offer some guidance to everyday people, not just hadith scholars, but to everyday students and people who are interested in, who want to understand, from the hadith's perspective, how to respond to this plague. So he has a very ingenious solution with this book. It's not just a compilation of hadith about the plague. He builds an argument on hadith, in the sequence of the hadith that he constructs. He brings in medicine, he brings in law, he brings in theology, and he brings in history into this book. And so this is why, I told, my colleague Miraj, we have to translate this book because it has some very interesting parallels with the COVID pandemic that we're living through now. So this is the book that he writes. So the first thing in chapter 1 that he struggles with is the origins of the plague, understanding where the plague came from, and he researches this. And again, this is, in understanding the origins of the plague, he even goes back to, Moses and the plagues, before, before the coming of Islam and before Muhammad. He looks in plagues in Ḥadīth that mention Moses and the plague in Egypt. But when he first looks at these Ḥadīth that discuss this word plague, he sees again, it's one of the many kind of paradoxes and problems that he's trying to unpack in this book, is this idea, like I was saying before, that the plague, according to this Ḥadīth, can be both a martyrdom and a mercy at the same time. Okay, so he recites this Ḥadīth, Gabriel came offering me pestilential fever and plague. I took the fever from Medina. I sent the plague to Syria, because the plague is a martyrdom and a mercy for my community and a punishment. So how can this be a punishment for those who do not believe? So how can this be? Like, how can the same disease be both a mercy and a martyrdom, and at the same time be a punishment? And so this is, again, one of the problems. One way, how do you solve this conceptually? And again, keep in mind, most people are not muhaddith. They're not great scholars who understand everything about Ḥadīth. So he's trying to figure out how to understand, how does this make sense? And again, it's this problem of suffering. How can it be these two things at the same time? So in chapter 2, he looks at a few other possible explanations for understanding the origins and the causes of the plague. Okay, so he hasn't solved this problem yet, and he looks, for instance, at the kind of the science of the time. What was considered modern science in the 15th century. They didn't understand germ theory. They didn't understand, all of the ways of disease transmission and the way that we understand it now in 2025 in the 21st century. But this is he records how modern science understood the plague in his own time. And these were the theories that, the most popular theory was the plague was caused by something called miasma, or polluted air, corrupt air. And that, the smog or this like stench would kind of float around, be blown by the wind. And it could come from swamps. It could come, after a big battle. There could be like a pile of corpses that were rotting, something foul that was attracting insects, and so this is kind of was one popular theory, and so a lot of the physicians of the time and the kind of the scientists of the time would recommend, okay, you have polluted air, well, you should get incense and different kinds, camphor and ambergris, and you should burn these, fragrant perfumes and incenses to kind of ward off this polluted air. So this was one recommendation. The other, they would think, maybe the plague was caused by some disturbance in the stars, if there was a meteor or something like that, and they took, the astrology was taken very seriously in Ibn Hajar's time, and he's not unique in this way. It wasn't just unique to this time. But essentially this idea that that you could look in at the heavens, you could look at shooting stars and things like this, and that this would be this would be some either a sign or a disturbance, would create something that was off balance, and this is how the disease would emerge. So this this is again, on the question of whether this was God's will or it wasn't God's will, these explanations, could be compatible. That God could will a meteor to come, or God could will a miasma to come. So it's not as if science and religion are in conflict over these kinds of explanations. But Ibn Hajar, when he studies the Hadith, he finds a different explanation in which, a different framework in which to understand the plague. And so this is what this is Ibn Hajar when he studies the Hadith. This is the key that helps him unlock this solution later in the book. And his explanation is that the plague are the pricks of the jinn. And so when Muhammad is asked, what is the plague? We understand, when they're told, when that the end of my community will be either by the sword or by the sword and the plague. They say, we understand what the sword is, meaning that they would die in a battle, fighting for Islam. But what is the plague? What does that mean? And the Arabic word here is ta'un. What is this? What does that word mean? And the reply is, they are the pricks or the piercings of your enemies among the jinn, and it is a martyrdom for both. And of course, there's another wording where it's not your enemies among the jinn, but your brothers among the jinn. So this is very interesting. You have different variants just of the same hadith, and Ibn Hajar goes into great detail about this debate. Are you being pierced by wicked jinn who are piercing good people, or is it good jinn piercing wicked people? Your brothers among the jinn, those who are supporting you. So he ultimately decides essentially that this is the key, because a key framework for understanding it, because the plague becomes a battlefield. It becomes a spiritual battlefield between the both jinn who are trying to pierce the wicked, and wicked jinn who are trying to pierce the good and the innocent and the pious, and the upstanding, upright jinn who are trying to pierce the wicked. And even though this may sound like a strange explanation, again in 2025 for the plague, or maybe even in the 15th century, we know that people doubted this idea, that the plague could be the pricks of the jinn. And keep in mind, first of all, that the scientists of the time could not explain the transmission of the plague, because it was not like COVID, like where if you got COVID, maybe someone else in your family would also get COVID, or if you have a cold, someone else will get the cold, or if you have the flu, someone else in your family will get the flu if they're exposed to you. What's strange is that you could be bitten by a flea carrying the plague. You could go to the market and get bitten by a flea carrying the plague, and then go home later that night with the plague. And your family, you could have buboes and you could be deathly ill. and other people in your family wouldn't be, it wouldn't be transmitted to them because they weren't bit by that same flea that was carrying this bacteria, because it was a bacteria, not a virus. It was a bacteria. So you needed to be exposed to that bacteria. So this is what they couldn't understand, and why the polluted air explanation just didn't make sense. So in a way, this idea of being pricked by the jinn helped. It actually jived. It actually seemed more appropriate to people's experience with this disease, that it seemed very selective, that one person in the family would get it but not the rest of the family, and sometimes the whole family would get it, sometimes no one. So it's just trying to understand this. But why this idea is so powerful for Ibn Hajar is, it allows then, once you understand this plague as a kind of a spiritual battlefield, it opens up other parts of this argument. Now, I said before that people doubted this idea in its own time, just like in the COVID pandemic. People, at least in the United States, I don't know what it was like where you are, but people really debated, is the plague, is COVID, should you social mix, should you social distance, should you wear a mask, should you not wear a mask? This was a big debate here in the United States, but we're a little crazy here. So, I don't know, maybe it was different where you are. But you see these same debates were happening in the 15th century in Egypt. So there's this amazing account that Ibn Hajar hears from an official who was a chief secretary in Cairo, who tells him this story, that he went to go visit the sick during the plague time, and he overhears two voices whispering, plotting to pierce someone with the plague. And he hears this dialogue between these two, who he thinks are these two spirits or these two jinn. And they're debating, they're arguing, no, strike him with the plague, no, don't. And then they agreed to strike, instead of striking the person, they strike his horse in the eye. So, and when he goes and he visits the sick, and he comes back later, he sees that the horse had escaped, and it had lost its eye. So then the official, this chief secretary says, since then I have sworn that the saying the plague is from the pricks of the jinn is true, and I used to have my doubts. So it's just amazing. You see that these ideas, this hadith, right, is having influence within the highest court, has the chief secretary behind it. But you also see that people are debating and arguing it as well. So it's in this way, it's a very interesting window into politics and religion, and the use of hadith in its own time. Now, the idea of the pricks of the jinn is so powerful, is because it helps you make sense of this issue of suffering, and how the plague can be both a martyrdom and a mercy, as well as this, a punishment, or, as an expression of, from God. So this is how it. This is how it works. Like later on in the book. So once you understand the plague as a spiritual battlefield between, the good and the wicked, this, amongst the jinn as well as amongst people, then you understand, just like on a battlefield, right? Innocent people die, people who are fighting, for good cause die, as well as people who are, who are you know, just as you know, people from all sides died, right, on a battlefield. You know, so in that sense, the plague is no different. And so, just like on a battlefield, innocent people can die and good people can die. Same in plague times. And so this helps reframe the plague as not just this horrible disease, a natural disaster like an earthquake or a famine, but really a battlefield. And in that sense, you know, that also was not so different than what happened, you know, during the COVID pandemic. People thought of, you know, first responders as heroes, you know, especially and this was in the United States. In America, I don't know exactly what it was like where you are, but you know, people would talk about, okay, we have to be on a wartime footing with this disease. We have to marshal all of the factories to, you know, make the vaccines and to make masks and make the glass for the vaccines and so forth. So this idea of kind of, okay, we are, in a sense, we are at war. We're in a battle. And so in that sense, people who die of the plague, they don't just die a meaningless death. They don't die, you know, in vain. They die in a sense fighting on this spiritual battlefield, if you want to think about it that way. And in that sense, you can actually, in Hajar's, you know, this is in his argument, based on the Hadith, is that when you die of plague, you can actually die as a martyr. And so it's not just this, you know, it's not this random connection between the disease and martyrdom, but this intricately constructed argument based on Hadith, starting from this idea of the cause of the plague being from the pricks of the jinn, into this larger idea of martyrdom, you know, for plague. And again, this is incredibly powerful idea, because people want to understand, like, why, you know, why is my death, why are, you know, why, what explains mass death, you know? And so trying to understanding it in this concept of martyrdom, and that the gates of martyrdom in a certain sense are open very wide in these times, and that an ordinary person, you know, doing something very ordinary, a kind act, a good deed, you know, helping someone out, is worth so much more when it's happening in the midst of this battle. And so this at a kind of moral level, this is a incredibly profound idea, and the whole thing is built on this argument for Hadith. So in a certain sense, Ibn Hajar is saying, you don't have to go out and do these processionals where you're praying for rain. In a certain sense, you have to reorient your framework for understanding this plague as a kind of a battle. And in that sense, you know, all of the other moral, legal, and theological actions flow from that. So in a certain sense, the way to respond to the plague is really to do, you know, to try to be a good person, to try to be moral in this moment. So this is what, you know, again, whether you agree with everything in his argument, it's really amazing to see the way in which he uses the Hadith to construct an argument that really responds to the politics of of his moment, you know, the history of his moment. So, for instance, there was a big debate in his time: should you flee from the plague if the plague strikes, or should you stay? So this was another interesting debate, you know. And again, looking at the Hadith, you get what seems like mixed messages. You know, one hadith says, if a great death strikes, stay where you are, don't leave. And we can talk about why. You know, again, why would you stay? Why wouldn't you just go run away? If everyone around you is dying and you feel like, okay, I'm going to die too before long, why shouldn't you just pick up and flee? The other hadith, on the other hand, says, right, so part of the explanation here before I go any further is, right, that, you know, that if you stay put, in a certain sense, you have, you know, you're not abandoning your commitments to your family. I mean, this is kind of, okay, maybe I will come back to this idea of why you should stay put, because it is very confusing. Ghazali has a very nice response to this. On the other hand, even though you should stay put, you know, there's this idea essentially that, again, they didn't understand exactly, you know, germ theory and these kinds of things that we understand today, and contagion and the transmission of disease. But in the 15th century and long before, the idea of contagion, like a disease jumping from one person to another or one animal to another, was seen as superstition. So it was like, you know, all of these, you know, old superstitions, you know, this idea of you know, a death bird or something like that, you know, kind of how people talk about like an evil eye or other kinds of superstitions. You know, we have this tradition here of knocking on wood and things like that for different superstitions. So it's not, it's kind of funny because you would say, oh, okay, this is somehow, you know, this hadith is against science or something like that. But actually this hadith is against superstition. So it's kind of, it's a little confusing, you know, to kind of go back and think about the mindset under which these hadith were originally transmitted and in which they were understood. But this idea essentially is that, you know, if you stay or if you go, you're going to get the plague either way, you know, or you're not going to get the plague. If you know, that in a certain sense, again, if you understand the plague as an expression of God's will, either you will be willed to die as a martyr or not. So it does have this kind of fatalistic or deterministic um, uh, um, dimension to it. On the other hand, when you know, if you try to understand why you might stay, what would be good about staying, is if, you know, you're in a certain sense, you know, you in a certain sense you are sacrificing your own life to be there for your community and not run away from it, and not run away from, you know, abandoning your family, right? Like if you flee the plague, you know, because you have the means and you have the ability, you're young, you're strong, you can leave, you know, you can leave the you can leave and go escape. But who are you leaving behind? You're leaving behind your sick grandmother. You're leaving behind those who are too weak to flee with you. You're leaving behind people who are already struck by the plague. You're leaving behind people who can't have their bodies washed and prepared and buried with dignity. So this was, you know, this insight from Ghazali was that, you know, the one who leaves the city that is afflicted by plague has not been rescued from that thing. First of all, you know, God either wills that you're going to be afflicted by this, struck with this plague, or not. So leaving doesn't do anything in this case. And second of all, if the healthy were allowed to leave, then there would be no one to attend the sick, and their welfare would be ruined. So thinking about the kind of moral obligations on you, to stay. So this again, this is again like thinking about in plague times how to respond when you don't have any medicine or any cure or any vaccine or anything like that. How do you respond, in a religious way? And this is part of Ibn Hajar's solution. On the other hand, there are, of course, other hadith that say if a place is struck by plague, also do not enter it. This is kind of interesting as another side of it, which again suggests more, would seem more in line with this idea of contagion and transmission, or suggesting this tool of a quarantine, staying away from people who are sick and diseased. But there's other explanations. It's just kind of one of the many quandaries that the book wrestles with, is trying to how to understand why you should avoid entering a place that's beset by plague, but at the same time not leave a place if it's beset by plague. So we can talk about this more maybe in the Q&A if you have more questions about that. But this, in the later chapters of the book, Ibn Hajar answers questions like, ordinary questions that people might have. If I'm living in a city and the whole town is struck by a plague, am I essentially, even if I'm perfectly healthy, but I know that I'm going to die, I'm going to catch the plague in a few days, I know I'm as good as dead. Does that change for legal purposes, how I can spend my wealth, for instance? Do I have to think about inheritance differently? Am I in the same situation as someone who's on their deathbed for legal purposes, even if I'm perfectly well and I'm walking around, I'm not sick at all, but I'm effectively I'm a dead man walking, because in a week or so I'm going to catch the plague for sure. So these are some of the debates that Ibn Hajar writes about and tries to address, and you can see these are the kinds of things that scholars would argue about and debate about it in their time. The book also gives you again some of these suggestions, other ways to protect yourself against what the physicians advise to protect yourself against the plague. And some of these things, like we said, it's not that they it's not that it's not that Ibn Hajar is against doing these things, but in a certain sense, it misses for him. It misses the larger point about what the plague is. Although these particular kinds of things, Ibn Hajar, certain kinds of practices, he thinks that there may be some basis in doing. And so lastly, what Ibn Hajar does is he provides a record of all the plagues in Islamic history, and he goes through year by year, almost in a chronology, of all of the major plagues, what their names were, any anecdotes relating to them. And so sometimes he records some funny anecdotes. This one he recorded, this was during the days of the Abbasids, when after the Abbasid revolution, one of the commanders marches into Syria, and he says, praise be to God who has dispelled the plague upon you ever since we came to rule over you. So he's boasting that, when we kicked out the Umayyads, we also got rid of the plague. And there's this funny story where some, the people who were in Syria were very skeptical of this Abbasid commander, and they stand up, and almost this is like almost like a joke, a kind of a plague joke, where he says, God is more just than to impose your rule, meaning your tyrannical rule upon us at the same time as the plague. So, that these would be two horrible things happening at the same time. You being in charge, and he would never put you in charge, and on top of that give us the plague at the same time. Because your rule is so unjust and so tyrannical. So it's quite you really get a picture of how societies responded to the politics of these pandemics and epidemics in different periods of time. And then at the very end of the book, Ibn Hajar, and this is where I'll close. Ibn Hajar he records a very famous poem about the plague called "The Tidings of the Plague" by Ibn al-Wardi, who was a different scholar who lived through the worst part of the plague in 1350 in Syria. And he wrote both a history of this plague, but also he wrote a versified, a poetic version of it. It's not actually in rhymed. It's in rhyming prose or sejet, but it is not technically a poem. It's more of a prose poem, if you want to think about it that way. But it is this amazing poem that sums up all of these arguments that I've been talking about, and it personifies the plague as it anthropomorphizes the plague as if he were kind of marching around from city to city and taunting each city. The plague even has a dialogue at certain points where he taunts or teases certain cities. So it's this amazing poem that we translated at the end of the book. So just in closing, I will read you a few sections from this poem, just so you can get a little understanding of it, because I think it gives you a sense of the cultural impact of the plague and how and the moral lesson, of course, is about the merits of the plague, how the plague time can be a time where you actually seek merit, how it can, what merit can this time be. So I'm just going to read this passage, and then I will end my lecture, and we can take any questions. Okay. The plague struck. Fear and death followed. For 15 years he roved, then lingered in China, in India, and Sind, far past the Oxus, in the land of the Uzbeks. For 15 years all were ensnared by his dreaded hand. None were spared. In every stronghold he found weakness. Count them. How many perished in Persia, Rome, and Cyprus? How many vanished from Crimea to the land of Khitans? In Cairo he crept upon every creature on whom he cast his eye, for they are on this earth. In Alexandria he stilled her draw looms. At her dead, at Tiraz, he spun like a slinking silkworm her spinner's fate. Alexandria, city of pestilence, a beast roars, patience, even when only 7 of every 70 remain. In Ma'arat and Nu'man he soothed, hush, hush, Hama's hurt has quenched my thirst. He beheld the village of Ma'ara as a heavenly nymph, her coal-black eyes alluring, but her brow was battered by abuse. What can a plague do to a place that tyranny thrust to the ground? He marched upon Sarmin and Fu'a. He rattled Sunni and Shi'a. He offered Antioch an ample share before retreating, whirling, as a man lost in flashes of his beloved in the campfire embers. He cooed to Shazar and Al-Harim, calm. You were in ashes before I came, and in ashes you will be after I go. Calm, calm, in time these ruins will be rebuilt. Aleppo, Land of suffering, the pestilence has become a vicious serpent. She kills your people with her venomous spit. By God, her evil is enough. If you could have seen the elites of Aleppo poring over arcane books of medicine, where numerous remedies abounded. They ate dried foods and citrus, slathered themselves with Armenian mud, brought their humors into balance, scented their homes with ambergris and camphor, sedge and sandalwood, adorned themselves with ruby rings, and dined on onions, vinegar, and sardines. In place of nourishing broth and honeyed fruits was citron, citron, citron. If you had seen Aleppo, the caskets crawling across every corner, if you had heard the sobs and howls, you would have fled, abandoning your homes. The undertakers' wages rose, their labor's sweat was sweet, but they played and preyed upon their customers like hustlers, and even as they turned most of them away, may their sweat turn sour, may they go unrewarded. The swindlers and the cheats have turned silver-gray Aleppo pitch black in my eyes. The coffin makers have begun to dig their own graves. His gunpowder bursts across nations, and anyone watching the explosions is gripped with reason-confounding fear. He chases down those screaming in panic. His flywheel spins. No ransom, no hoarded treasure can be paid. His flywheel spins. He breaks down the door of a house, swearing, I have a warrant for you and your family's arrest. I will not leave without taking you all. And yet, there they are, the merits of the plague, freeing one from the desires of worldly gain, perfecting one's deeds, awakening one to forgotten obligations, and readying one for the final journey. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions. And I wish everybody well if I don't get a chance to speak with you. And I hope that this is of some benefit or help to all of you in your studies.
Hi, sir. So I have a question.
Hello. Yes.
When you are translating a classical Islamic text written over 600 years ago, so what was the greatest challenges over translating the book?
Yes. It was what was difficult about translating the book was that it wasn't just a book of hadith, it was also medicine and law and theology and history and poetry. So we had to learn a lot of different genres. Each one has their own particular technical language, their way of writing, their way of their own specialist language. So this was partly what was difficult about it, but I really enjoyed translating. I really recommend it. It's an amazing exercise and practice. I learned so much about the Arabic language translating it. I learned all of this. I learned so much from translating the poetry as well, and I really recommend everybody give it a try, and don't use just Google Translate or ChatGPT or any of these kinds of things to try to translate these works, because you really understand a text when you try to read it in its original language, and then you try to wrestle and think about what was the author trying to say here. And it was great having Miraj to translate it with, because we could go back and forth and debate. Oh, I think Ibn Hajar is saying this. No, I think Ibn Hajar is saying something different here. And we would argue, and that would really help our translation, because sometimes we would come up with different interpretations of what he was saying. And sometimes we would get it completely wrong. And we'd have to go back and revise it. There were certain sections that were so difficult. But I learned so much just from the process of translating. So so I think the challenges were what kept it fun, I would say, and both fun and also rewarding were the challenges, and the least interesting parts were the hardest to translate, because there wasn't much to debate or argue about. So yeah, so I hope that helps answer your question.
Sir,
Yes.
in the introduction of your book, Merits of Plague, you're mentioning French philosopher Albert Camus, who wrote The Plague of 1947. So, sir, please explain that. What is the main difference of his work with Merits of Plague by Ibn Hajar?
Okay, well, this is interesting. Albert Camus is a French writer. He's kind of an existentialist writer. I guess sometimes people almost could think of him as a philosopher. What's interesting about his book, of course, his book was the book that everyone was reading during the COVID pandemic. It's a novel. It's not a work of theology. It's not a work of guidance for the plague. In a way, it struggles with the same themes and ideas that Ibn Hajar struggles with, because it's trying to make sense of mass death. Is your death meaningless or not? When there's a plague, and how do you respond to it? With quarantine, with medicine, what do you what do you do with that? And it's about the modern world. And interestingly, that book is supposed to be set in French Algeria, which would have been the place where there would have been libraries where people were reading Ibn Hajar's book, and where people would have been thinking about the plague, in this Islamic perspective. They would have been reciting Hadith about the plague, but there's not a single Muslim character in his book, not a single Arab character in his book. There's no mention or any understanding of the Islamic tradition in that, of course, in that book. And if you want to think about that in a charitable way to Camus, you would say that's his argument. He's saying in modernity, people have lost a connection to the traditions in which to understand and make sense of these kinds of plagues. And so death feels meaningless. It's just like your death during the plague, it has no meaning. You don't die for a great cause. You don't die, martyrdom or anything like that. It's just your death is meaningless. And so in a way, it's a kind of critique of the modern moment. This feeling of why does it matter? What does existence matter? And so Ibn Hajar's book, of course, doesn't see it this way at all. He has a conceptual framework grounded in the Hadith for understanding this, this horrible moment in history. But the way I was thinking about it and talking about it with Miraj is just, it's just this, this idea of when the pandemic happened, the books people read, there were so few books about plague. People wanted to try to understand, what is the plague? How have people, this isn't the first time in history we've had a pandemic. COVID isn't the first pandemic. Of course, we had the flu 100 years ago. But world history is full of these terrible pandemics. And the Black Death is the worst of them all that humanity has ever faced. And it wasn't just in 1350 or the 1400s. People were fighting plague, you know, it would just recur in different waves in different places up until the 19th, even the early 20th century. So, and it reshaped our entire history. So, you know, what are the cultural resources? What are the ideas that people can read and yeah, take some consolation in? You know, what books do we have in our libraries that we can read to try to understand the plague? We have this one book from Camus. This is the French writer who basically, you know, wonders if the death is meaningless or not. And in a way, you know, the Islamic tradition, there's nothing translated into English. And in a way, the Islamic world is best positioned to understand the Black Death, because in Cairo, they were at the crossroads of global trade in this period. You know, they were right in between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, which opened up into the Indian Ocean. And, you know, in the Islamic world, because you have the Hajj, pilgrimage, you have this whole world from West Africa to Southeast Asia to, you know, Central Asia, everybody convening in this one part of the world. Of course, you also have these Silk Roads, overland routes. You have this wide world. So if there's a disease, a pandemic, the best place to look at it wouldn't be in Western Europe, which is isolated from the rest of the world, but would be to look at the literature of the people who sat at those crossroads. So Cairo is actually a great place to look at it. And the fact that you have this great treatise on the plague that is like an anthology of everything, you know, history, medicine, law, poetry, theology, that grapples with these big questions. This is, you know, our hope was, you know, to get this book out so that people have some broader perspectives, a richer understanding of literature, not just, you know, and not just for Muslims who are studying Hadith, but for everybody who might stand something to gain for how, you know, human beings and different societies have responded to these kinds of diseases. So it's a very different book than Camus, and that's a good thing.
So, I have a question. We are making a 40 others collection on global epidemics. So, please suggest some books on this topic or anything else. We are working on it.
That's amazing. 40 Hadith. This is really amazing. 40 Hadith collections are they're great. You know, these 40 Hadith collections. First of all, it's amazing that you are working on this. It's you know, people have been writing 40 Hadith collections about plagues. I mean, there's a very famous one from the Ottoman Empire. You know, going back, I want to say 300, 400 years, sultans used to commission 40 Hadith on the plague all the time. I mean, this is a great way to try to address a specific topic using Hadith. And you know, of course, the main thing you want to think about, you know, when you, you know, the you know, the way I when, you know, when I look at 40 Hadith collections, the ones that the ones that you could use to, you know, often these 40 Hadith collections are used as teaching texts, right, where someone can walk through Hadith by Hadith and really show the different range, the different dimensions, the different problems, the different angles of a problem. So, you know, the 40 Hadith collections that you often see Hadith commentators praising, or the ones that they comment, are the ones that earn commentary, right? The ones that inspire debate. So, including hadith in there that that aren't just repetitive or repeating the same thing over and over again, but spark different kinds of debates, problems, and conversations. And the hadith, that the 40 hadith collections that that I've seen that have been the most successful in the tradition are the ones that include hadith that might even be on the surface seem to be problematic in some way, because it gives the teacher a chance to try to explain a difficult issue or a difficult topic. So Ibn Hajar's work on hadith, he's collected, I think, almost every hadith on the plague. So you can go back and take a look at the hadith in his work. There are many other plague treatises that have collected hadith, and you can look at those as well. But yeah, I think it's very interesting to hear that this is something that you're working on. And I would just say I would just say, there's no shortage of hadith that you will find. What Ibn Hajar does in addition is he goes and he grades the different hadith. And so this we put in the footnotes of our book, because for most readers of a book like Penguin Classics, they don't know anything about isnads, they don't know anything about sahih, da'if, hasan sahih, they don't understand. We tried to put some of that material, at least in the footnotes, to try to indicate, which hadith Ibn Hajar thought were sound, which one he thought were weak, and why that supported his argument. Why when he was trying, for instance, is the plague the pricks of the brothers of your jinn or the enemy of your jinn? And so he goes through the authenticity debates, the soundness debates. And so that's something that you can think about as well, in terms of, Ibn Hajar is a great resource for thinking about which ones, he thinks are considered sound, and which ones he thinks are fair, and which ones, he thinks are weaker. But I think, it depends what your goal is, because it could be, that it would be, it wouldn't be uncommon, even to include weak hadith in a 40 hadith collection, if it had some benefit or shed light on some issue. It just depends how you're using, how you want to use it, if it's going to be a teaching text or something like that. So but I think, for a 40 hadith collection on the plague, I can't think of a better book to study than Ibn Hajar's Merits of the Plague. And you can take, and to study it, if you have the ability to study it in the original Arabic, where he goes through all of the arguments about the different isnads, and I think that will be most helpful for you.
So, with all due respect, I'm inviting one person. In this webinar, we have a guest, Irshad Davi. I think you are familiar with him. He had written an review on this merits of flag and published it in the on these various sites. It's like Islamic Insights and like that. So I'm inviting Mr. Irshad Davi for sharing his experience on while he's just writing review on this book.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the invitation. And I also thanks Mr. Joel Blecher for a wonderful work, Minutes of the Black. I think you remember me that you have messaged me to share the PDF of my book review. So basically, now I am studying in Morocco, and I started to read the merits of the plague twice, because now I am working on devotional practices and its socio-political aspect. For example, in Morocco, as you know, the Dalail al-Khairat, a devotional text that was written by Jazuli Imam in Morocco, and it was circulated in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa. And that was circulated in the colonial lands. Okay, I think the students can relate these types of devotional text. For example, in 2022, in a from manuscript, I mean from archival documents on Mr. Shivadasan, a associate professor in Calicut University, he uncovered a copy of interview some anti-colonial warriors. In that interview, a anti-colonial warrior, his name is Ali Muslia. He requested the interviewer to bring Dalailul Khairat to his jail. So I think that the spread of these types of devotional texts across the lands, across the region, there is a great influence of colonialism, and this text is written in a time of crisis, that Imam Jazuli wrote this devotional text Dalail Khairat in the time of a Portuguese aggression in Morocco, and this same text circulated in South Asia in the time of colonialism.
Wow.
So, as you, in the merits of the plaque, we can read that Imam Ibn Hajar Al Asqalani advised some types of litanies, Sufi litanies, and supplications, some prayers like Quranic recitation, and some types of dhikr, adhkar, awrat, to as a remedy for this plague. So I think the devotional text and some types of adhkar, aurat, as a great influence in the lives of Muslim society, as a refusal, or in the times of crisis. So I started the reading the merits of the plague once more. So basically, I am so grateful for your work, because if the translation was didn't done by you in the times of Corona, the text will not reach the audience. As you, yeah, as you said in the in introduction, the text is written by the Ibn Hajar Asqalani in the 14th century, but the classical, I mean, in the Muslim society didn't know about, doesn't know about this book very much in the times of uh, after the 15th or 16th 17th century. But your translation work is a very grateful, it's a wonderful approach to this, to familiarizing these types of text in the global academic world. And once more, I am very grateful, and once more, I appreciate your wonderful work. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say. And that's fascinating what you say about the Dalal al Khairat and Al Jazuli and colonialism, and the way that text is being read in Southeast Asia, and the context of the Portuguese you said as well. It's fascinating how these texts move across the world and intersect with world history and social and political history. That is really amazing what you just described. And I think it's so important for us. I do think sometimes there is a temptation when you read these books, that it's like a closed world. You enter the mind of the book, and you're very deep in the intricacies of the arguments, and you're looking, sometimes you go very right. These scholars are reading line by line, word by word, and you can get completely lost in the kind of intellectual, the beauty of the intellectual interpretation and the intellectual gymnastics. But to then step back and say, well, what does it mean for ordinary Muslims' lives? What does it mean for their world? How are they trying to help their public and their audience? And to see the ways in which these books interact with the real living history, as you described, that's amazing. Colonialism and, the Portuguese and, these books traveling, these great distances. It's fascinating to hear about Irshad, and I really wish you a lot of success with your work. And, I would just say, yes, I would just say, when I went to Cairo and I gave a different version of this lecture at the American University in Cairo, one of my colleagues told me Ibn Hajar Al Asqalani is buried in the Qarafa cemetery in Cairo, and you can go visit his grave. And it has been, he has like a little, I don't know how to describe it, but there's a structure around it, and you can go. It's being renovated right now because it had fallen into disrepair. And so I went there, before I gave my talk. It's like a 2-hour taxi ride, and we're driving through this cemetery, and we're asking, does anyone know where Ibn Hajar's grave is? And we're asking everybody, and they're saying, okay, go to the right, and oh no, you should go to the left. And finally we find it. And just by luck, by chance of luck, the gatekeeper, the person who's there to protect it while it's being renovated, happened to be there. And when we knocked on the door, he came out. He said, no visitors are allowed. I told him, well, I translated his book. I would really like to visit, to see to see where he's buried, even if it's under renovation. And so he said, okay, you can come in, but no photos, no photographs, because it's still, under construction. And so when I went in, of course, it was amazing to see, and you can see his tombstone. And the amazing thing about it, which connects to what you were saying, Irshad, is that who is the person repairing and paying to repair and to reconstruct it? It's Shafi'i students from Indonesia and Southeast Asia. This is a place, who are coming back, who read Ibn Hajar after 4 centuries. They're still reading his works 5 centuries later, in a completely different part of the world, in a completely different context. And they are coming back, and they're the ones restoring his, his final resting place. And this is a place, an island he never visited. Maybe he didn't even know it existed. Maybe he knew of a place named Java, but not much more than that. So it's really amazing, when you think about the Islamic world and these texts like Dalal al-Khairat by Jazuli or Ibn Hajar's Merits of the Plague. These are books, that can circulate, not just in Western Europe, but they were circulating around, these scholarly networks that were spread out across the known world, from West Africa to the Middle East to Central Asia to South Asia, and eventually to Southeast Asia. And in each context, these books, sometimes they seem like they're written as if they're divorced from their context. Like that they're somehow, set aside from the world, that they're compartmentalized in some way, from the politics of the day, which is partly what allows them to adapt to all of these different places. But you have to keep in mind what the teachers, the commentators, the people transmitting these books always have to do is then connect these works and their ideas and their texts to the world around them. If it's, the colonialism of the Portuguese, if it's a pandemic, if it's, something else that's happening more locally, the task of the scholar and the commentator is always to try to get these texts that seem timeless to try to speak to their own world. And so, what I try to do in my work as a historian is to try to help shed light on that connection between the intellectual ideas of a text and the social and political world around it.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a question. My question is very simple and curious. We can see there is a picture of a colorful snake in the cover of book. So what's mean by this photograph or the cover of this book?
Okay, that's a great question. So it's an image of a snake, but it's not. It's just a metaphor. It's not a. It's not an actual represent. It's if you see, the snake is actually shedding its skin, and underneath there are flowers, meaning that the snake, which we had found in a footnote by Michael Dole's, different scholar, historian of Islam, had studied the Black Death in the Middle East and had translated Ibn al-Wardi's Merits of the Plague. And you noticed in that poem that the plague is understood to be a vicious serpent. And in that poem that I read, I won't go back to it now, but maybe I can read this. Read this line to you again, just to help you remember. But in that poem, Ibn al-Wardi writes, "The plague has become a vicious serpent." This is a snake. "She kills your people with her venomous spit. By God, her evil is enough." So the snake is this. The snake is this. Is this representation of the kind of wickedness of the plague. And yet the plague also has these merits. So what you see on the cover of the book is that the plague actually it's an illusion in a way, that there's actually flowers blooming underneath. So this, they asked us about what to put on the cover of the book, and we don't have any control. We said you should put Arabic calligraphy on it, and these kinds of things. But they had hired an illustrator, and so when the illustrator heard that in the Islamic tradition, or in at least in 14th, 15th century Islamic culture, people understood the plague to be like a serpent or a snake. The illustrator took this idea to kind of represent the plague, and then the idea of flowers blooming, within the plague, that the plague is an opportunity also for merit, and for something good to come out of it. There was a really powerful idea, and actually the illustrator won an award or won a prize for that cover. And it's a very very interesting. It's a very interesting cover. And of course, Miraj and I, went back and forth and debated, the idea, as should it have been made out of calligraphy instead of being, illustrated in quite this way. But and in that sense, it's a different kind of book, right? It's for a general audience, and it's not. Penguin Press is not a religious press, so they won't put sallallahu alaihi wasallam after every time you mention the Prophet. So it's for a broader audience, but I think it's a very appropriate symbol. And the snake shedding its skin and seeing flowers blooming underneath the snake, I think, is a very powerful image. And we took it from this idea, from this poem that describes the plague as a snake.
Sir,
Yes.
what do you think that the book is more relevant for the current time in which we face different epidemics than the time in which Ibn Hajar wrote the book? And is the reason you translated it during the epidemic of corona?
Yes, yes, it is. I don't think I would have translated, I wouldn't have even thought of doing the book had it not been for the corona. I called it COVID during our talk, but it sounds like you call it corona. We call it, coronavirus too. But yeah, the coronavirus, I was at the Library of Congress. I was working on my book I was writing about Ibn Hajar and the spice trade. And I was thinking about these two worlds of commerce and market and economics and the world of Hadith. Because Ibn Hajar also lived between those two worlds too. And he thought about the management of the spice trade. And, he thought about kind of justice in economics and business and the world of wealth, and how it is that Hadith and Islam, a vision of Islam, could help make the world kind of this moral economy, reflect his visions of justice. And I was looking at it in this broader landscape, not just Ibn Hajar, but many other scholars, and how they debated, how to shape this world of commerce. Because, of course, Cairo, as I said before, was at the center, the crossroads of commerce. So I was working on that book, and this is a book I'm working on this spring as well. I'm hoping to finish it this year. So it's a completely different topic. Has nothing, has maybe only a little to do with the plague. But I had been working on that book at the Library of Congress, and then we got the email. The Library of Congress will be shutting down because of Corona. Take all of your books, do everything you have to do. Everything will shut down. So, everybody's work stopped. Everyone had to move. You couldn't access the library anymore. It became the whole world changed. If you remember, it felt like everything changed, and so it was in that context that I had called up my friend Miraj, and I was telling him, Ibn Hajar actually wrote one of his most important books, right? Like Fath al-Bari is his magnum opus. That is his masterpiece. That is his, his life's work. But the Merits of the Plague was a very important work in excuse me, in the Islamic tradition. A plague treatises in particular, it was a very influential work. And it was a work that was written for a general audience. And you could see in the times of Corona, what you saw the most, of course you saw mass death, you saw some displacement, you saw the economy turn upside down, but you also saw people, especially in the United States, I don't know what it was like where you were, and I'm repeating myself a little bit here, but, people would debate, should I wear a mask or not? Should I social distance or not? Can I go visit? Can I go socialize with other people or not? Should I go visit the sick or not? All of these, and what's the origin of the disease? Was it, in America, we debated, did it come from a lab in China? Or, did it come from a market, like some open air animal market? And people debated, what's the origin? Is it is it transmitted? Can it be transmitted in the air? Is it transmitted just through touch? So people didn't understand how it was transmitted either. So for a lot of reasons, this was a lot of the same debates that people were having in the time of the Black Death. Should I social distance or not? How is the disease transmitted? What do you do? How should you respond to it? So a lot of the same debates, we had gone through before, 500 years earlier, even though it was a very different disease. So yeah, for that reason, I see a lot of parallels between Corona, the time of Corona, and the time of the Black Death, in which Ibn Hajar's treatise was written. And I think it teaches us an important lesson, which is that when, in history, when there's a pandemic, you don't just have death, you also have debates about public health. You have debates about the origin of the disease and the meaning. You have a debate about what is the meaning of the disease. And I think that's something that's very important. If you have, a government agency is not well placed to try to answer what is the meaning of this disease. A government agency, especially in a democratic society, is not well placed to try to help you grapple with the issue of meaning of the disease. So this is why, a book like this is so interesting, because it tries to offer an account, a way to grapple with the fundamental questions that are raised by everyone. We all saw the death counts every day. 25 people a day, 100 people a day, 200 people a day, 300 people a day, 1,000 people a day dying from corona. How do you make sense of that? As a human being, how do you make sense of this? And a government agency, it can help institute public health. It can help make sure the hospitals stay open and that people, can, that there are first responders there who are safe. But it's not in a really good position to try to grapple with some of these bigger issues about how do you respond in this situation. And so this is why, it was so interesting reading and translating this book during Corona. But I also hope that even after the Corona has ended, that people still, that there's something to learn from this book. And of course, the next time there will be a pandemic again, maybe it'll be 100 years from now. Maybe, hopefully, we will not live through another one in our lifetime. But if another one happens in 25 years or 30 years, maybe people will return to this book again. Because this is what happens. People, in times of crisis and things, people turn to texts and they turn to books to try to help understand our situation, and they turn to history and try to make sense of it.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, I have a question. There are some people who are justifying the epidemics are the part of necessity of the world to tally its population. So how are you looking towards this type of justification?
Can you repeat your question? I don't know if I understood what you're saying.
There are some people who are justifying the epidemics are the part of the necessity of the world to tally its population. So how are you looking for towards this type of justification?
I'm not sure I understand. You said they're justifying the pandemic based on maybe can you put it in a different way or phrase it differently? That they're justifying it as part of the necessity of the world, that is just part of the world, that it's not, that there is no meaning to it. Is that what you're saying? Or it's not an expression of divine will, or?
They are justifying that the epidemics that it's a necessity of the world to tally its population by like COVID and the plague and other types of war. They are the necessity of the world to tally its population. So how are you looking towards this type of justification?
To what? There's one word I don't understand. To what population? To reduce the population?
Yeah, to reduce the population. The
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I don't know that I make much of this argument. You know, I don't think I don't know. I think it's very sad, that people. I don't know if I understood your question correctly, so forgive me if I misunderstand what you're saying. But it's sad, the pandemic is real. It really hurts. It doesn't just hurt people through death, but it also hurts people through long-term chronic illness. So even people who survive may live with with versions of corona that are troubling them. And it's and it ruined people's lives. People lost their jobs, their businesses. They lost not just lost their family members, but maybe their family members became disabled. They were no longer able to take care of themselves because the disease was so hard on them. And so many people's school, right? Their school was interrupted. So many children lost years of their education in America. Again, I don't know what it was like where you were, but yeah, I find it sad, that people think, these diseases are to reduce the population, or just a necessary thing. There, of course, I think that there is maybe, clearly there is part of living in a globalized world is that we're connected to each other. So if there's a disease that crops up in one part of the world, then it affects another part of the world. So we're all integrated with each other. So in this way, yeah, it's in this way it's an outcome of the world that we've built, this modern world that we've built. And I know some people see this as a critique, right? Like maybe we should all go back and live in the woods and not connect with each other and live far apart from each other. And maybe there's something to that, and that we've grown, our society's grown too massively. But this is it's a very sad thing, when a disease like this affects people. And I wouldn't I wouldn't ever think or say that this would be for reducing the population or saying something like that. So but again, maybe I misunderstood your question. So but I hope that my answer is helpful to you in some way.
Okay, we think it's time to conclude our session then.
Okay. Thank you
Before
so
coming
much.
to it, I just gave some insight to you about our institution and our university. As I previously mentioned that we are studying in the Sheikh Auliya Dawa College, Odamala, which is affiliated to the Darul Huda Islamic University. The university, the Darul Huda, is an educational revolution in the India, especially in the South Kerala, in which there have a lot of students studying with both religious and the materials knowledges. And under its graduates and post graduation, there have a lot of departments is working on the, and the hadith and related science is one of the dip which we are studying on it. Annually we are conducting just a conference, academic conference, just national conference. We are conducting on the various topics like our first was about with the Indian scholars, Indian Hadith scholars, and the second was on the Sahih Bukhari, and the third was on the migration, like which based on the Hijrah. As just like this, we are conducting a lot of programs on the in this Hadith field, both international webinars and our journal, the Isnad Hadith journal and Isnad podcast. Such like we are conducting a lot of programs. Okay, just first and foremost, I'm giving a heartfelt gratitude for you for sharing your valuable time with us. We know your schedule is very busy, and just like that, just I'm giving my grateful gratitude from the part of the department and institution and everyone to you. Also the attendees who gave their shares and comments and actively participated in this webinar. Thank you for
And thank you so much for this kind invitation. It was a pleasure, and I hope our paths will cross. It was very nice to hear from you, Irshad, as well. And I hope our paths cross at some time in the future, and we can meet in person somehow. I wish everybody the best of luck and the best of success in your studies.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.